It can be strongly argued that Sweden is the mother of the modern-day fairy tale, and this claim can be traced all the way back to Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's king from 1611 to 1632. Gustavus is often credited as being one of the greatest military commanders in modern history, and during his reign, Sweden became one of the primary military forces in Europe. But what is often overlooked is his contribution to preserving much of the country's oral folklore. The king instructed priests to collect and catalog stories and legends from the area, even those that were not sanctioned by the church. And this folklore became an instrument to introduce new Christian beliefs to a population that was mostly pagan. Thanks to the work of these priests, many stories, legends, and beliefs that would normally have been lost to the tides of time were written down and have become the basis for what we know now as fairy tales. One of the most enduring fairy tales is that of a young and beautiful princess who pricked her finger on a spinning wheel, falling into a deep slumber that she could only be woken from by the kiss of true love. As children, we watched Aurora dance her way into a happy ending with stars in our eyes, believing that love could conquer all. As adults, we understood that it was just a fairy tale, but we still appreciated the magic it brought to our younger years. But we never imagined that a person could sleep for years, only to then wake up and go on with life as if nothing had happened. And it's only fitting that since many of our modern fairy tales stem from the early folklore of Sweden, the woman who would give us the opportunity to believe that it could be real would have been born there. But before we dive in to today's strange and unusual story, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If you aren't using a VPN, you should be. And there's no better option out there than Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a modern VPN. It's designed with the user in mind. And that means that not only are their utilities powered by robust security mechanisms, but they're also designed to be simple and intuitive to use. And if I'm saying that it's simple, that means it is, because I am notoriously technologically challenged. I just suck at everything technology. I can't do it. I break it. It breaks around me. I don't know. But Surfshark VPN is just very, very simple to use. Surfshark encrypts and protects all your data sent via the internet, including your passwords, private messages, private photos and videos, credit card information, everything. And they keep it safe from prying eyes. They have so many features that are beneficial, including Clean Web. Clean Web blocks ads and malware before they can load, and this allows you to save mobile data, it allows you to boost your browsing speeds, and avoid phishing attempts. They also have a strict no-logs policy, which means that Surfshark does not keep usage logs and store details like your IP address, browsing history, session information, or anything else. Surfshark does not keep track of your online whereabouts or actions in any way, unlike your internet service provider. Most internet service providers are required to store this information for years. And in the US, they can legally sell information like this. So even if you have nothing to hide, it's a huge invasion of privacy. Surfshark even has a no borders mode, which allows you to get around inconvenient geo-blocking. So like if you ever clicked on a video on YouTube only to be told this content isn't available in your country. Geo-blocking is a way of limiting access to certain websites based on your geographical location, but Surfshark feels the internet should be open for everyone. Because you're being blocked based on your IP address, Surfshark allows you to change your IP to make it look like you're somewhere else, and that gives you access to a plethora of new content that isn't available in your country. If you've been dying to watch something on Netflix, but it's only available in the UK, you can now watch it with just a few clicks. Best of all, Surfshark allows you to connect and use unlimited devices simultaneously, so you only need one account, but everyone in your family can reap the benefits of Surfshark VPN. Right now, I have Surfshark on all of my computers, and I have three computers, on all of my tablets, all of my kids' tablets, on my phone, on my husband's phone, on my mom's phone, because she's always clicking on things she shouldn't be. Right now, for a limited time, you can get 83% off a 2-year plan with Surfshark VPN, plus an extra 3 months for free. All you have to do is go to surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe and start protecting yourself and your data now. This special offer makes your subscription just $2.21 a month, a literal steal, so you can browse securely on all your devices. Once again, go to surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe to get 83% off a 2-year plan and 3 extra months for free. Thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Karolina Olsson was born on October 29, 1861, on the tiny island of Okno, just off of Sweden's eastern coast in the Baltic Sea. There she lived with her mother, father, and 5 brothers in a small cottage. Karolina's father supported the family by catching and selling fish, an activity that he would often bring his children along for because they didn't have a lot of money, and it was usually an all-hands-on-deck situation. The Olson family fished their days away, living a happy and simple life until one day, which seemed to be a day like any other, when 14-year-old Karolina fell asleep and stayed asleep for 32 years. It all began on February 18, 1876, a cold and frigid day. Karolina was walking home, and she decided to take a shortcut over a frozen river, eager to get back to the warmth of her family's cottage. While crossing the river, Karolina allegedly slipped and fell, hitting her head on the ice, and when she finally arrived home, she told her parents what had happened, and she was quickly examined. Aside from some bumps and bruises, Karolina appeared to be completely fine, and she was a strong girl who performed manual labor on a daily basis, so her parents fed her a hearty dinner, and they went on with life as usual. But over the next few days, Karolina began to complain of headaches. The headaches started out mild, but they grew in intensity as time went on, and she also mentioned that she had a toothache that would just not go away. There was no doctor in their small village, and initially, Karolina's parents worried she had become the unwitting victim of some mischievous witch. The people of 19th century Sweden believed in a wide variety of supernatural beings, such as trolls, elves, Selma the sea serpent, and many other fantastical and sometimes terrifying entities that go bump in the night. But they also believed very heartily in black magic and witches. If you were to visit Sweden right now in the month of April, you might become confused and wonder if they were celebrating Halloween instead of Easter. You would see children dressed in rags with dark makeup smeared on their faces, traveling from door to door with brooms between their legs, collecting candy from their neighbors. This is a tradition known as påskcarring, which translates to Clean Thursday, and it is celebrated every April, the night before Good Friday. The tradition originates from the belief that on this night, witches would fly on brooms, making their annual journey to a mysterious place known as Blue Mountain to perform their Sabbath and cavort with Satan himself. For hundreds of years, the people of Sweden would lock their doors as evening fell, and they would light bonfires to deter the witches from getting too close to their humble abodes. As a sign of appeasement, they might even leave gifts for the witches, objects that might make their long journey easier, such as food, milk, clothing, and fresh broomsticks. Today, the children of Sweden dress up as those witches and collect their own gifts in the form of candy. Given this enduring belief, it's not hard to understand why Karolina's parents may have attributed her mysterious symptoms to the work of some dark force. But one evening, not long after her fall on the ice, Karolina went to bed, and the next morning, while the rest of her family got up at dawn to go about their daily tasks, Karolina could not be roused. As I said, the Olsons lived in a very remote area, and they didn't have the money to send for a doctor from a neighboring village. So, in the first days and weeks of Carolina's uninterrupted slumber, her parents did not have much of a choice but to take care of her the best they could and hope that she would wake up. Mrs. Olson force-fed her daughter milk and sugar water, and various neighbors and midwives stopped over to offer support and advice for what the young girl could be suffering from. They tried everything to get Carolina to wake up or respond at all. Her body was poked with needles. The needles were even inserted under her fingernails, and an open flame was placed directly to her skin, but nothing worked. Carolina continued to slumber, only occasionally sitting up and mumbling prayers she had learned as a young child before falling back onto her pillows, still fast asleep. This continued for some time until the people of the village where the Olsons lived collected enough money to bring in a doctor from a nearby town who traveled to Oakno in order to examine Carolina. This doctor declared that Carolina was in some kind of coma, and over the next year he continued to come back to check on her, along with other doctors who had heard about the mysterious sleeping girl, but there was no change in her condition as the weeks and months passed. The medical professionals all noted that Carolina's hair and nails, they didn't seem to be growing at all, which was not the normal behavior of the body during a coma state. It was as if she had been frozen and suspended in time, and no one could make heads or tails of it. The original doctor who had first diagnosed Carolina as being in a coma eventually wrote a letter to the editor of Scandinavia's top medical journal, calling for other doctors and experts to offer their opinions and advice. And these experts and doctors began to descend on the small village in droves. One of the doctors who answered this call for help was Johan Emil Almblad, who decided that Carolina had fallen into a deep sleep state as a result of hysteria. Ah, good old hysteria. The answer to whatever ailed women in the 18th and 19th centuries. We have the wise old philosophers of ancient Greece to thank for this. Plato felt that women who exhibited signs of nervousness, insomnia, fainting, and the like were suffering from what he referred to as the roaming uterus. It was theorized that the uterus of a woman could wander about her body, placing pressure on other organs and causing a plethora of troubles. Understandably, men of science at the time were obsessed with the womb, and they believed it was the key to explaining why men and women were so different. The Greek physician Arietaius of Cappadocia called the womb an animal within an animal and believed it could, quote, move itself hither and thither in the flanks, end quote. But frail women of the world who are in possession of a rogue uterus should not concern themselves because there is a cure. According to Arietaius, the womb delighted in fragrant smells, and it would move towards those fragrant smells. So if you find your uterus is on the move, all you have to do is lay down on your back and place something sweet-smelling down there. I like to use freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. That seems to be what my uterus responds best to. Also lilacs, but it's just hit or miss. It depends on the day. Then just relax, read a book, listen to some music, and wait for your uterus to find its way home again. Our good friend Sigmund Freud had other ideas to explain why women are so crazy. He felt that women experienced hysteria because they were unable to reconcile the loss of their metaphorical penis. And his cure was a bit more elaborate, but just as effective. All a woman would have to do is find a man, one with a penis preferably, get married to him, and have sex. And by following this simple 3-step process, you too can regain the penis you have lost and be cured. Hysteria was essentially the way for men to come to terms with everything they didn't know or understand about women, which, given what we've already learned, seemed to be quite a lot. Like everything, they were confused about everything. Oddly enough, even though the human race would come so far over the next century, hysteria was not removed from the DSMV until 1980. We put a man on the moon, and discovered penicillin before we accepted that sometimes people just go through the gigs. So, Dr. Almblad thought that Carolina had become hysterical, so hysterical that she just couldn't even any longer, and she had to take a nice long nap. In July of 1882, Carolina was brought to a hospital in Oskarshamn, where she was treated with electroshock therapy for this hysteria diagnosis. Now, by the end of the 19th century, electrotherapy in its many forms was the treatment of choice for a wide range of mental and physical illnesses, including hysteria. By that time, physicians of the day did not attribute hysteria to a wandering uterus or a longing for a penis, but they saw it as a disease rooted in invisible lesions of the nervous system that could be cured if these lesions were stimulated, if the nervous system was stimulated. But this did not cure Carolina, and after several rounds of this therapy with no results, she was released from the hospital and sent home on August 2nd with a new diagnosis of dementia paralytica from the doctors employed at the hospital. Now, it's unlikely that Carolina actually suffered from this, however, considering that dementia paralytica is a declining disease. It's commonly associated with syphilis. It's commonly seen in much older individuals. It's believed that Henry VIII actually suffered from this as well. So it is very unlikely that Carolina, as a young girl, was suffering from this. But as Carolina continued to sleep with no change, regular people in the medical community alike lost interest. And much like the mythical Sleeping Beauty, who slumbered away in the forest for decades, life around Carolina moved on while she continued to lay in her bed. In 1904, Carolina's mother passed away, and after this, a maid was hired to care for Carolina and keep the house while Mr. Olson went out fishing in order to provide for the family. And at this time, Mr. Olson was also getting up there in age. And Carolina's 5 brothers, obviously, they were older now. They were growing up. They had families of their own, etc. In 1907, one of Carolina's brothers died in a drowning accident, and it was reported that Carolina began sobbing in her bed when the news arrived, although she appeared to remain asleep. Now, the woman who had been hired to watch over Carolina made some observations. She, like so many others, was well aware of the unbelievable story of the young local girl who had fallen asleep and managed to stay alive on 2 glasses of milk a day. And this maid reported that the young girl, who had grown into a young woman as she slept, would sometimes moan in her sleep or change position, but she would never fully wake up, at least not while the maid was present. But there was some suspicious details that the maid noticed. Carolina's fingernails and hair never grew. Her hair was always clean, even though nobody was putting her in the bathtub to bathe her, as far as the maid knew. Additionally, the maid would sometimes bring candy to the cottage, and at certain times of the day she would have to step out to run some errands. When she returned, she noticed that some of the pieces of candy were missing, but the only person in the cottage was the sleeping Carolina. But according to Carolina's brothers, who were present at the home on some evenings after the maid went home, their sister never woke up, at least not while they were there. More shocking than anything, however, was that although years passed, Carolina did not seem to age, or she did age a bit, but at a much slower pace than a person normally would. On April 3rd, 1908, the maid was going about her chores when she heard a racket coming from Carolina's room. She rushed to the room and entered the room to see Carolina out of bed, staggering around, confused and crying. Carolina was immediately surrounded by her remaining family members, but she didn't recognize any of her brothers who had grown into men. Carolina had been asleep for 32 years and 42 days, but despite this, she seemed to be completely healthy. Her muscles had not atrophied from decades of inactivity, and even though she had not gained the normal amount of weight or body mass for her age, she was physically healthy. She did initially show a strong aversion to sunlight, as if it caused her physical pain, but other than that, she seemed all right. For several days, Carolina seemed to be in shock, and she did not speak a word. But when she finally was able to have a conversation, she revealed that she could remember nothing from the past 32 years. The last lucid memory that Carolina claimed to have was from when she was a 14-year-old girl during that cold February of 1876. Carolina did speak of foggy wisps of rosy dreams and terrifying nightmares, however, even though she claimed she hadn't heard anything that was going on around her in the home as she slept. Some of what she reported seeing in these dreams were blue faces in an ocean, and many people wondered if this was just a coincidence, the fact that her brother had died by drowning and Carolina was seeing these blue faces in an ocean, like drowning people. Carolina could not remember her mother sitting at her bedside praying for her recovery. She could not remember her brothers pleading with her to wake up. To her, she had fallen asleep a 14-year-old girl and woken up a grown woman. Doctors were called in to examine Carolina, but they still could not figure out why or how she had been asleep for so long. They also could not give a scientific reason for why she had aged so slowly. Even though she was now a woman in her 40s, she had the appearance of being in her early 20s. She could still read and write at the level she could when she was 14, and she performed well on mental tests, telling the doctors that she was not only mentally sane but intelligent and sharp-minded. The only thing that seemed to cause Carolina a great deal of confusion was how much the world had changed around her as she slept. Her brothers were now older men. Her mother was gone. The entire world was a completely different place than she had left it. In the aftermath of Carolina finally waking up, the press went wild. In 1910, the Wilmar Tribune reported, quote, "It is 2 years since Carolina Olson awoke after a sleep of 32 years. During the 2 years of her new life, she has stayed at the home of her childhood, and she seems to be perfectly normal in every particular way, excepting that she looks to be only 30 years old, when in fact she is 46, end quote. There were a lot of newspaper articles that I found about Carolina Olson, but they were not in English, and I found them on newspapers.com, so there's no translate function as far as I can tell. If there is, let me know. But I wish that I would have been able to read what they said because there was tons and tons of coverage about her. That same year, 1910, Swedish psychiatrist Harold Frodostrom began examining Carolina, trying to determine if there was some sort of psychological reason for why this had happened to her. He found that Carolina was a pleasure to be around. She was charming, and she acted like a young girl, coy and shy and naive to the circumstances of adulthood. At points, this psychiatrist felt she was kind of like flirting with him a little bit, kind of like a little girl would, not really knowing what flirting meant, not really knowing how to do it, but still being charming at the same time. Harold did not believe that Carolina could have actually been asleep for 32 years. It was medically impossible for her to have survived and been in good health if she was being force-fed 2 glasses of milk a day. He felt that Carolina must have had to have gone through some sort of traumatic experience that caused her to feel as if she needed to escape from the world. And he believed that it was possible Carolina's mother, Mrs. Olson, had facilitated this in an attempt to protect her young daughter. But what could have happened to Carolina on that cold February day in 1876 that made her want to just crawl into bed and sleep for over 30 years? Many people believe that she could have been the victim of an attack by one or more people, an attack that a 14-year-old girl who had grown up sheltered, who had attended Catholic schools, could not come to terms with. This is called Resignation syndrome, even though there was no name for it in 1910. And it is explored very well in the 2020 documentary Life Overtakes Me, about refugee children in Sweden. In a BBC article from October of 2017, we find that for nearly 2 decades, Sweden has been battling this mysterious illness that affects only the children of asylum seekers. These children withdraw from the world completely. They cease to walk or talk or open their eyes. There are hundreds of cases of this, including the case of 9-year-old Sophie, who arrived in Sweden in 2015 after becoming a refugee from the former USSR. The article says, quote, 9-year-old Sophie is lifeless. In contrast, her hair is thick and shiny, like a healthy child's, but her eyes are closed, and under her tracksuit bottoms, she wears a nappy. A transparent feeding tube runs into Sophie's nose. This is how she has been nourished for the past 20 months, end quote. According to Dr. Elizabeth Holt Krantz, the world has been so terrible for Sophie and the children like her, that they've gone completely into themselves and disconnected from the conscious parts of their brains. The children who are the most vulnerable are those who have witnessed extreme violence, often violence directed towards their parents or loved ones. Sophie's father admitted that Sophie had witnessed both himself and her mother being dragged from their car and beaten by men in police uniforms before they made it safely to Sweden. And I just have to give a shout out here to Sweden. Sweden is notoriously one of the best countries if you are a refugee. They are so kind to their refugees, so giving, so caring, so accepting, warm, and welcoming. And shout out to Sweden, shout out to those who live there. It's a real true feat of morality and compassion that you open the doors of your country, your home, to people you don't know, from a different country, from a different culture, and you accept them as your own. Thank you for that. 2 sisters from Kosovo also became bedridden and unresponsive. In 2017, one of the sisters had remained that way for 2 years, the other for just a few months. In an NPR article, a reporter writes about seeing these 2 girls and how surreal it was, saying, quote, "There was a disconnect between how young and healthy, even beautiful they looked. They looked like they were sleeping. It was a sickening feeling knowing that they were in that position for years. People make comparison to bears hibernating, but humans do not hibernate." End quote.
This is the home of Ariana. She is an asylum seeker suffering from a condition known as the Resignation syndrome.
She is exactly the same as she was when I saw her the first time in February 2016. It's still a child, and that is 2.5 years ago.
When Ariana was 7, she learned that her family's asylum application was rejected. She stopped eating and drinking. Eventually, she went into this state of hibernation.
Between 2003 and 2005, 424 cases of resignation syndrome were reported, and there have been hundreds more since. Some people wondered if these children were faking their symptoms or if their parents were faking the symptoms for them, just as people speculated that Carolina Olson and her family had been faking her symptoms. But some of these early cases were admitted to the ICU. They were separated from their parents and kept under close medical scrutiny, and they still did not wake up. These children are often referred to as appearing to be in a coma, but many of these children have also been seen crying or exhibiting occasional eye contact. And that sounds very much like what Carolina went through. I definitely suggest giving this documentary a watch if you're interested in learning more. I wish I could talk more about it. I wish I could dedicate a whole video to it. It's incredibly sad. You guys know anything to do with children, it breaks my heart. Any hurt coming to children breaks my heart. Children are small and innocent and full of joy and light and happiness and hope for such a short time before, adulthood comes and just breaks us of all of that, right? I'm being dramatic, but you know what I mean. And to think that these kids are just living in their home countries and something happens in those countries that causes their parents to become attacked, to become targets, and these children have to witness their parents being beaten, their parents being dragged away and imprisoned, maybe never coming home, things like that. The horrible terrors and horrors that they experience that causes them to completely just turn off like they were unplugged from a wall. It breaks my heart. So I will link in the description box where you can find further information on resignation syndrome, where you can find the documentary and things like that. Another theory is that Carolina may have been suffering from a condition called Klein-Levin syndrome, otherwise known as sleeping beauty syndrome. Now, KLS is a rare disorder that causes recurring periods of excessive sleepiness. And in some cases, those affected can sleep for up to 20 hours a day. The disorder can affect anyone, but it is most commonly seen in teenage boys, and about 70% of people with this disorder are male. Affected individuals do not usually have any symptoms between episodes. They are completely normal. They go about their lives as they would any other day. But when the symptoms do appear, they can last for days, weeks, or even months. People living with KLS may get up to use the bathroom or eat, but they will then return to bed and continue sleeping. And because the fatigue is so severe, they are bedridden until the episode passes. Now, it isn't known what the exact cause of KLS is, but some doctors believe it can arise from an injury to the hypothalamus, the part of your brain that controls sleep, appetite, and body temperature. Some patients have also been known to suffer from KLS after an infection, like the flu, and this leads some researchers to wonder if it may be a type of autoimmune disease. It also appears that it could be genetic when more than one person in a family has it. That's pretty common as well. Now, I believe at this time, under 100 cases have been reported of KLS around the world, so it's very rare and it's still very much not a well-understood condition. 17-year-old Sharik Tovar suffers from KLS, and she suffered with it since she was 2 years old. During her episodes, her mother has to liquefy her food and feed Sharik every 2 hours. At one point, Sharik fell asleep for 2 months, and after these longer episodes, she experiences temporary memory loss to the point where she doesn't even know who her mother is. Nicole Delian also has KLS, and she sleeps for 18 or 19 hours a day sometimes, waking up to eat in this zombie state that she doesn't remember. She started showing symptoms when she was 6 years old, and when she was 17 in 2012, Nicole slept for 64 days in a row. Eric Haller, another person who suffers from KLS, goes into an episode about 8 to 10 times a year, and during these episodes, he sleeps for a month or more. He told ABC News, quote, "When I go through it, it's complete hell for me. It doesn't feel real and it's hard to understand what people are saying. It's so frustrating because I want to understand," end quote. Eric's mother, Lori, claims that she never knows when the episodes are going to happen, saying, quote, "It's like a light switch and he turns into a child. He likes sleeping and is very crabby and he doesn't like to talk," end quote. There's no known way to treat patients who suffer from KLS, but it is believed that children eventually outgrow their symptoms because doctors never see KLS patients in their 40s, and that is significant to me because Carolina Olson came out of her slumber in her 40s. As I mentioned before, many people believe that Carolina was faking it and that her mother and possibly her entire family were helping to keep the hoax going. I think it's far more likely that Carolina did suffer from one of these disorders, but since it was the 1800s, they didn't know what to call it or how to handle it. I will admit that I do think it's unlikely that Carolina slept the entire 32 years. It's far more likely that Carolina simply experienced episodes throughout those 3 decades and was at times able to get up, bathe, eat, have her nails and her hair cut before falling back into bed and going to sleep. It is pretty clear to me that Carolina did not sleep the entire time because we would have seen a physical manifestation of that when she woke up, right? She would not have been able to spring out of bed and wander around her room because her muscles would have been atrophied, as is the case in some coma patients. Because a coma prevents you from using your muscles like you normally would, the muscles atrophy, or in other words, waste away and degenerate. Many coma patients face permanent muscle damage and have to undergo years of physical therapy. I would also expect Carolina to have bed sores. Those are ulcers that emerge on areas of the skin that are under pressure from lying in a bed or sitting in a wheelchair for a prolonged period of time. According to the doctors, Carolina had none of these physical ailments. As far as her not aging in the way she should have, she obviously started sleeping when she was 14. She woke up when she was 42. She's not going to look 14 at 42, no matter what if she was able to do that, put me to sleep. Put me to sleep for 32 years. I'm all down for it if I can wake up exactly the age I am now. But the point is that's not physically possible either. What's more likely is because she was in bed, in the house, away from the sun, she probably didn't, get a lot of the sun damage that we know causes aging. That just makes sense. Her family and stuff's out there fishing on the water of all places where the sun's going to hit you the hardest. They're going to have, suntans. They're going to have leathery skin. Her father probably had that old fisherman look with the leathery skin. And Carolina, inside in her bed, not ever going outside, is not going to be exposed to the sunlight, to any sort of environmental pollution, things like that can age you and cause aging in your skin. So to me, that's the explanation for that. Now, I don't think it's nefarious what the Olsons did because I do think the entire family was in on it. The brothers, the mother, the father, everybody. They must have been in on it. Because it makes sense to me that the Olsons would not have wanted to reveal Carolina's periods of consciousness because there would have been a stigma attached to Carolina at that point. Your daughter is so lazy. All she does is sleep all day. Your daughter is mentally ill. They would have called her crazy at that time, right? Or possessed or something. She needs to be put away in some far-off asylum. Or even worse, your daughter's been touched by the devil, and we don't want her in our village any longer. I really don't believe there's any malicious intent. And although some have speculated that the Olson family enjoyed the attention and maybe even financially benefited from this situation, there's really no evidence that either is true. And their financial situation didn't seem to improve after Carolina fell ill. It's not like they were traveling the world with their daughter, showing her off at fairs and expositions and stuff like that. They didn't seem to really enjoy the attention all that much. And you would think after Carolina was sleeping for a while and people lost interest, at that point they would have been like, all right, the hoax is up. Get your ass out of bed and start fishing again. We need you to start providing, right? It just doesn't make sense that there was any sort of like financial gain for the Olsons. I do look forward to hearing which theory you think is more plausible in the comments, or if you have another theory. Do you believe it's more likely that Carolina suffered from resignation syndrome, maybe from something very traumatic that she experienced? Maybe it wasn't a fall on the ice that caused her bumps and bruises. Maybe she was attacked by some village boys, sexually assaulted, hurt. Do you think it's more likely that she suffered from Klein-Levin syndrome? Do you think that she and her family made the whole thing up for attention or money? Or do you think that Carolina, like Aurora, pricked her finger on a spinning wheel and fell into a deep sleep, waiting for the kiss of true love to finally bring her back to the real world? And by the time she was 40, she was like, this is never going to happen. I just got to take care of myself. Let me know in the comments what you think. But while I have you here, let's talk about Sleeping Beauty and her story. Because although Carolina Olson has been referred to as the real Sleeping Beauty, I think we have at least agreed on the fact that her case didn't necessarily go down like that. Like, she definitely wasn't sleeping for over 30 years, the whole time. But there was a real Sleeping Beauty, or at least the original Sleeping Beauty, and her name was Talia. Walt Disney was the OG cultural appropriator, building a multi-billion-dollar company off of stealing stories from other countries and cultures. This may be a hot take or a controversial stance, but I'm still going to talk about it because I truly believe it. I mean, let's not even talk about how he stole Mickey Mouse from somebody else. Maybe we can do an entire video on that guy's depravities because there's many of them. And some of you may disagree and some of you may be like, no, he was just inspired and, okay, inspired, fine, whatever. But when it comes down to like the fact that this complete corporation has basically taken over the world, it just looks a little bit more nefarious. Disney's insanely lucrative movie Frozen was based on Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen, and The Little Mermaid was also based on a Hans Christian Andersen creation. Snow White was originally a story that the Grimm brothers told, as was Cinderella. The real story of Sleeping Beauty was originally published by an Italian poet named Giambattista Basile, and it can be found in his collection of fairy tales titled Pentamerone, published in 1634, under the name The Sun, the Moon, and Talia. It's strange to think that many of us were raised on Disney movies, not knowing the original dark stories that inspired the rose-tinted fairy tales we devoured over and over again. In fact, I was just talking to somebody on actually a business call, but for some reason, business calls with me always turn into me rambling about something that I'm interested in, and then they pipe in, and then before you know it, we're off to the races, and we're not talking about what we came to talk about in the first place. But he said something really interesting to me. He said, if you think about it, everyone under the age of 60 was raised by Disney movies, was raised with Disney movies. And it's so true. From me to my oldest daughter, who's 20, to my youngest daughter, who's 5, Disney movies are a part of our lives. They are this very real and big part of our lives. When I was a child, when my 20-year-old was a child, when my little Bella, who's 5, is a child. It's crazy how influential they are, how prevalent they are in our lives, how prevalent Disney is in our lives. So, The Sun, the Moon, and Talia tells the story of a baby girl named Talia. Talia was born to a great and powerful ruler, and when she came into the world, he sent word to all the wise men and astrologers of his lands to come to his palace so that they might give some insight into the little girl's future. These men concluded that the royal child would meet her end from a flax splinter. So her father, the Lord, commanded that all the flax be removed from the palace, and Talia was never told of her grave prophecy, because it's best to protect women and children by just keeping them in the dark instead of letting them know about the fears and the dangers out in the world so that they can protect themselves. So Talia grew up in ignorant bliss. She became a lovely young woman, but one day she was looking out of her bedroom window and she saw an old lady spinning flax on a spindle. Now, unlike the Sleeping Beauty story, this old lady was not a witch. She was not a mean person. She was not trying to hurt Talia. She, I believe, was just from like a distant land, and she was traveling through, and she had her little spinning wheel with her, and she just stopped to make some thread, I guess. And Talia is obviously intrigued because she'd never seen anything like this before. So she approached the woman and she asked, "What are you doing?" The kind old woman was charmed by this beautiful young girl, and she allowed Talia to stretch the flax. But during this process, Talia got a splinter from the flax lodged underneath her fingernail, and she fell to the ground, dead. Talia's father was heartbroken and inconsolable, and he ordered that his daughter be dressed in her most beautiful and magnificent gown before placing her on a velvet throne in one of his homes deep in the forest. He then ordered the large home to be locked up and abandoned. But Talia was not dead. She was just in a deep sleep, and sometime later, a king from neighboring lands, he was out hunting in this very forest, and his companion, a large falcon, launched off of his arm and flew to this deserted, abandoned home hidden amongst the trees. And the falcon soared through a window of the home. The king ran after his pet, and he banged on the door of the home, but no one answered. So he looked up at the house, and he sees there's foliage, ivy, climbing up the walls. So he grabs onto this and he climbs up the walls of the house, and he entered through the same window his falcon had flown through. Now the king walked from room to room, finding the house to be completely empty, until he came upon a beautiful young woman asleep on dusty velvet. He tried to wake her, and when he couldn't, he carried her to a nearby couch, and having decided he was in love with her, he had sex with her. I would say that Talia was unable to give her consent for this act. With today's version of Sleeping Beauty, people are legitimately upset that the prince kissed Aurora without her permission, so if they knew the real story, they'd have an aneurysm, right? After this deed was done, the king returned to his own lands, and he didn't think about Talia again, but inside of Talia, 2 babies were growing. Luckily, a group of friendly and helpful forest fairies came upon Talia, and they made sure that the babies were delivered safely, and they cared for the babies after their birth. They even made sure that the babies were able to nurse from Talia as she continued to sleep. But one day, one of the babies missed its mark and sucked on Talia's finger instead, causing the flax splinter to dislodge and causing Talia to finally wake up. Suddenly, from his kingdom, Talia's king, suddenly remembered that he had fallen in love with the sleeping woman, and he returned to the house in the forest only to find that he now had a son and a daughter whom were named Sun and Moon. The king told Talia who he was and what had happened while she was sleeping, and apparently she was totally okay with this, because as they spent the next few days together, they became closer and closer, and she fell in love with him as well. There was a problem, though. This king was already married, and even though he wanted to bring Talia and the children back with him, he could not, for fear of the queen's wrath. So he returned to his kingdom alone, but he never stopped thinking about Talia and his children, and in his sleep he would call out their names. And his wife, the queen, hearing these names emerge from her king's lips while he was sleeping, she became very suspicious about what he was doing during his long hunting trips. The queen summoned her personal secretary, and she told him, "Listen, you got to be honest with me about what's going on. What's my husband, the king, doing? Be upfront with me, tell me the truth, and you will be rich beyond your wildest dreams. But if you lie to me, you'll never be found again, dead or alive." Damn, queen was a gangster, right? Facing these 2 choices, if you can call them choices, the secretary spilled the beans. The queen knew that it was not only her place in the king's heart that was threatened, but also her place on the throne beside him, so she formulated a plan. She sent her secretary to the house in the woods, instructing him to tell Talia that the king had summoned their children to the palace because he wanted to visit with them. He missed them and wanted to see them. So Talia allowed her children to make the journey to the palace, but they were not brought to the king. Instead, they were placed before the royal cook who had been instructed to basically use the babies, the king's babies, and cook them into a delicious dish that would then be served to the disloyal king. Now, obviously, the cook could not go through with it because he wasn't a dick, and instead he brought the babies home to his wife. Now, when the king and the queen sat down for dinner that evening, she watched with relish as he devoured dish after dish. And he kept saying, "Oh, this is so good." And she continued to repeat to him, "Eat, eat, you are eating of your own." But even after this evil deed the queen thought she had committed, she was not satisfied, and she once again sent her secretary to the house in the woods to bring Talia back to the palace. Upon Talia's arrival, she was not met by a king with love in his eyes, but a queen with vengeance in her heart. The queen told Talia that she knew who she was and what she had done with her husband, and Talia tried to explain, "Listen, lady, I didn't do nothing. I wasn't even awake when your husband had sex with me, so you're mad at the wrong person." But the furious queen would not hear it. The queen told Talia that as they spoke, a large fire was being lit in the courtyard and Talia would be thrown into it for her sins. As Talia was being dragged to her fiery death, the king walked out. And he was like, "What is going on here?" He demanded to know what was happening. And the queen gleefully told the king that she knew everything. She knew about Talia, she knew about sun, she knew about moon, and she'd watched the king eat his own offspring. The king was devastated. He was beside himself, and he ordered that the queen be thrown into the fire in Talia's place, along with the secretary that had facilitated her evil plot. The cook was also next in line for the fire when the terrified man revealed that he had not harmed the children at all. The king and Talia were overjoyed. They got their kids back, they were married, and they lived with their 2 children, Sun and Moon, happily ever after. Now, the beginning of this story is very true to the source material somewhat, and it ends with a happily ever after, which is the trademark of a Disney movie. But all the stuff in the middle was dressed up to be turned into a film that children around the world would enjoy and base their idea on love and marriage upon. And that's interesting to me. It's also a bit strange and unusual, but now it's time for you to tell me what you think about all that we have discussed in this video. Put your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very, very soon.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say I Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood, blood on the strings, blood, blood on the strings, blood, blood on the strings. Being played from my face, don't bleed. Got blood, blood on the strings, blood, blood on the strings, blood, blood on the strings. Lord knows it's been a rough week. Yeah, I'm channeling my son house, 'cause I gotta let this